Well, good morning, everyone. I haven't yet figured out the right permutation of the joke, whether we're starting on Russian Standard Time or Venezuela Standard Time or some combination daylight savings. But we are starting just a little bit late. Thanks for bearing with us. We have a really full but incredibly star-studded panel this morning. It's an enormous privilege to be able to just introduce this event and then get out of the way and sit with all of you and learn something. I think we do have plenty of time, though, for discussion and questions, and my wonderful colleague Cindy Arnson, who heads the Latin America program, will run a tight ship, I'm sure, to make all of that possible. I do want to thank Cindy and all of the Latin America program staff, my own team at the Kennan Institute, who've made this possible. I'm Matt Rojansky, for those of you who don't know me. I direct the Kennan Institute. I'm not going to say much of substance about the Venezuela crisis. I think crisis is the right word. Everything that I have read and seen about what's happening in Venezuela seems to be an understatement when you put it all together. It's truly a crisis that's greater than the sum of its parts, and the geopolitical angle of it that we'll be able to consider today in terms of Russia's involvement here in the Western Hemisphere is obviously non-trivial as well. And the Wilson Center, if I can make a plug, really is the right place to have a conversation like this. You'll see on the table outside two papers that make immediately obvious, one by Vladimir Ruvinsky, who's with us on the panel, and another by Michael Penfold, who's currently a fellow at the Wilson Center. It just makes obvious the advantage that the Wilson Center brings in having cross-regional conversations, which are so rare in Washington, this being still a stovepiped town. We were actually voted this year #1 in the world in regional studies by the University of Pennsylvania think tank rankings, which we're very proud of. We're not totally sure what it means, but we're very proud of it. And I think that this conversation, though, is a beginning to an answer to that question of what does it mean to do regional studies. Obviously, we're going to have real cross-cutting issues as well. Subject matter experts on energy, on questions of sanctions are important too. But deep knowledge of Venezuela, of the region, and deep knowledge of Russia are very much what this is about. So that's all I have to say. Let me introduce Cindy Arnson to you. She is a widely recognized expert on Latin American politics and political economy and international relations, including, of course, U.S. policy in the region. She is co-editor of Latin American Populism in the 21st Century, which was published by Johns Hopkins several years ago, editor of In the Wake of War, Democratization and Internal Armed Conflict in Latin America, published by Stanford, and author of Crossroads, Congress, the President, and Central America, 1976 to 1993, published by Penn State in 1993, and other publications. She's a member of the editorial advisory board of Foreign Affairs Latino America, the Spanish language edition of the well-known journal Foreign Affairs, and is a member of the advisory boards of the Social Science Research Council's Conflict Prevention and Peace Forum, the Salvadoran Foundation for Economic and Social Development, and Human Rights Watch Americas. And without further ado, Cindy, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Matt, thanks for that very gracious introduction. Is this on? Yes? Good. Okay. Venezuela will hold presidential elections on May 20th. Everyone expects that the current regime of Nicolás Maduro will win those elections. It's not 100%, but it's very, very likely, given the ways that the political opposition has been restricted, jailed, and banned from participating. At the same time, there have been any number of discussions in the Western Hemisphere, most recently at the Summit of the Americas, where Vice President Pence met with a number of heads of state, trying to build a regional consensus about what to do about the Venezuelan crisis, which I don't have to elaborate in detail, is the most profound economic and humanitarian crisis in modern Latin American history. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have fled Venezuela. Inflation is estimated this year by the IMF to be about 13,000%. Massive hunger, the collapse of the health system, a real collapse of governance at every level, with the exception perhaps of the repressive apparatus. So the United States is currently the largest purchaser of Venezuelan oil. Oil constitutes over 90, something like between 90 and 95% of Venezuela's export revenue. And there are a number of international companies, including Russian companies, that are involved. So at the same time that Venezuela is a growing, and has been for some time, concern in the Western Hemisphere and of the United States and its policy vis-a-vis the region, the United States is by far, and Latin American countries by far, not the only international actors. So this meeting today represents an effort to try to build out some of the understanding of the international dimensions of the Venezuelan crisis, involving, of course, the U.S. government, but also Russia. In future times, we'll be talking about China, we'll be talking about Cuba, and possibly India as well. So again, as Matt mentioned, I think this is a unique capability of a place like the Wilson Center to foster this, this cross-regional learning. People have bios. For the sake of those watching the webcast, I'll introduce our panelists only very briefly so as not to take up too much time. We'll begin with our two Venezuelan speakers. First, Michael Penfold, a global fellow of the Latin American program, who joins us from Caracas, where he is a full professor of political economy and governance at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración y ESA, one of the most renowned public policy schools in Caracas. He's also a visiting professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. Following Michael, we'll hear from Francisco Monaldi, who is a fellow in Latin American energy policy at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Texas. He is also a fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Then we'll hear from two Russian experts on Russian foreign policy and Russia's interests, not only in Venezuela, but in the region. First, Vladimir Ruvinsky, who is director of the Laboratory of Politics and International Relations and associate professor of political studies at Cali, Colombia's ICESI University. He has had a lot of, he has had appointments in research institutes in Russia, Japan, as well as Colombia. Then we will be joined by Victor Heifetz, who is joining us from St. Petersburg State University, where he is a professor at the School of International Relations and director of the Center for Ibero-American Studies. And he has a PhD from St. Petersburg State University and has studied not only Russian foreign policy, but Soviet foreign policy before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And last but not least is Risa Grace-Targo, well known to many of us here in Washington, who is Director for Latin America at the Eurasia Group, where she specializes in the coverage of Venezuela, Ecuador, Central America, and the Caribbean. And she also brings expertise, as does Francisco, on the energy industry. So I'm going to ask each of you to speak for 7-8 minutes. I'll keep time. I'll pass papers as your time is expiring. I will direct one or two questions if time permits, and then we will open it to questions from the audience to have a very active exchange. If you would like to ask a question at the end of the presentations, all we ask is that you raise your hand, and we'll bring you a microphone so that people in the room, but also people on the webcast, can hear what you're asking. Finally, another note of thanks to colleagues in Kennan, especially Madison Brady, as well as in the Latin American program, Jacqueline Dolezal, for all of their help in putting today's meeting together. So we'll start with Michael.
Well, thank you, Cindy, for the introduction, and Matthew for helping organize this terrific session on Russia and Venezuela. And what I want to sort of share with you is my skepticism about the idea that any single country, be Russia or China or any other a foreign country, can deal alone with the problems that Venezuela is facing and the magnitude, not only of the crisis, but of the social and economic collapse that Venezuela is experiencing at this point. the Venezuelan crisis has several dimensions. It has a very important political dimension, which is a democratic breakdown. It's a collapse of democratic institutions and the ability of existing institutions to deal with the internal conflict that we're facing, and particularly the ability of citizens to choose, to truly choose their government. But now that crisis has developed even further into a crisis that has an economic dimension, where we're starting to experience something that is relatively new and very important in terms of its social impact, which has to do with hyperinflation. Since October last year, Venezuela is officially under a hyperinflation, but in the last 3 months, that hyperinflation, in fact, has accelerated dramatically, and that is, I think, a very important issue. Oil production has been collapsing. It has been collapsing for the last decade. It has collapsed for the last 5 years, but in the last year, we have almost lost over 1 million barrels of production. So this is something that is accelerating also at a very fast pace. What's happening in the oil sector, and social indicators are deteriorating to the point where poverty levels are almost at 90% of the population, and extreme poverty over 50%. We have a migration crisis that is now the largest refugee crisis that we have experienced in the Western Hemisphere in recent times. And the size of this crisis, I think, is important to assess really the nature of Russia and Venezuela's relationship, as well as the Chinese and Venezuela's relationship. I think that under Chavez, for Russia, Venezuela was really a platform to engage with a region that was experiencing the pink tide and that was moving towards the left. And we have Russia engaging with Lula in Brazil, with Kirchner in Argentina, and with other countries, particularly with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. So this was seen as an opportunity. I think under Maduro, the Russian view on Venezuela is different. It has much to do with how they perceive they can help to stabilize a regime that is being challenged by U.S. foreign policy, a foreign policy that is aiming at regime change, and where they believe they can play an important part in helping the regime survive. And as I will try to argue, I think the difficulties in terms of the size of the, particularly the financial requirements that Venezuela has to stabilize its economy, to reconstruct the oil sector, are going to make it very difficult for that objective to be achieved. So far, Venezuela and Maduro in particular, I think, are trying to use the relationship with Russia in three very different ways. First, they're trying to use Russia as a way to counteract and counterbalance U.S. influence, particularly by using them as a key institution in places like the UN, for example, and also by providing the military support that through equipment and maintenance that the armed forces in Venezuela require. So the Russian relationship is very strategic at that level. Secondly, I think that Russia has also become, in the mind of the government, an important way to help in the case there are oil sanctions in Venezuela, that oil sanctions do escalate, and in some ways, in different ways that I'm sure Francisco Monaldi is going to talk about. Russia is seen as a key ally to help Venezuela diversify oil markets that we know it's going to be very difficult to do in the short term, but where the government perceives that Russia can help them in terms not only of investment, but also in financing, in refining capacity, in links with India, and even in commercialization. So there's a view that Russia can help in the case of oil sanctions escalating. And the third objective, I think, is to leverage on Russia, which is also an oil economy, that is also struggling with sanctions from both the US and Europe, to bypass sanctions. And these are two economies that are struggling with the same issues. And both countries, therefore, are oil economies subject to these kind of sanctions, and Russia can provide that kind of support to help Venezuela, in their mind of the government, to bypass those sanctions. And when we see the experiment, which I think is a failed experiment with the cryptocurrencies, basically what we're seeing is a shared effort in terms of trying to cope with that situation. Now, why do I think that the Russian-Venezuelan relationship is going to struggle to achieve these objectives? I think basically it has to do with financial reasons. When you look at what Venezuela is facing, and you look at the baseline scenario, that is Maduro stays. Let's assume that Maduro stays, that he's able to cope with the election on May 20th. He wins. He doesn't get the international recognition, but yet he stays in power. Well, he has two options in terms of economic policy and oil policy too. First option is to remain with the same set of failed economic policies in Venezuela. But the problem is that before he could sustain that for a longer period of time because he had assets to sell. This is a government that doesn't have any more assets to sell. And let's assume that the Chinese are benevolent and that they keep extending the moratorium on Venezuela's debt payments to China. And let's suppose, and being also optimistic, that Venezuela is able to stabilize oil production. And let's assume that oil prices remain stable around $60. Well, in that scenario, assuming that Venezuela remains with the same levels of imports that we had last year, which were extremely low in per capita terms, you would require over $5 billion in financing. Let's assume that you have the worst case scenario, which is what I think we're heading to. Oil production keeps collapsing. The Chinese moratorium, which we'll know by the second term of the second semester if it stays or not, is removed. And let's assume that the oil remains around $60. In that scenario, you are going to have financing requirements of over $13-14 billion just to stay with the status quo. This is not to change the economy. This is just to stay where you are. And let's assume, so that scenario, what it's telling you is that even if Maduro stays and wants to remain with the same set of economic policies, he's going to face tremendous financial needs in an environment where he has international sanctions that basically impede him to restructure existing debt, both for the sovereign and PDVSA. But let's suppose that Maduro changes. He's running a campaign right now saying he's going to change, that that we didn't get the Maduro version. Is going to be the first version is a different version for what he's gonna do in the second term. But let's suppose he decides to change. Let's suppose he decides to stabilize the economy. Let's suppose he decides to attract investment in the oil sector to stabilize production and even grow production. Okay, what would it take in terms of financial requirements? Well, if you want to stabilize Venezuela's economy, you're going to have to access at least $20 to $25 billion to stabilize the economy in the first year. And if you're going to try to do something with the oil sector, you're going to need to attract at least $15 billion, according to Francisco's own account, for example, to stabilize production in the oil sector. So we're talking here of a major financial requirement that's going to need a major change in policy perception, in confidence. That I think is also a very challenging situation. when you look at this, at the end you ask yourself, okay, well, can Russia provide the kind of support either to stabilize the status quo or to shift the country towards a more sustainable economic model? And in fact, when you talk to people close to the government, they're already seeing Russia, and particularly the Putin regime, as a reference. They would like to shift state-owned assets to their own interest groups. They would like to have a more stable macroeconomic environment. But the truth is that Putin had to go to the IMF, and Putin was able to shift these transfers while increasing oil production in Russia. So doing this in an environment where we have sanctions is going to be extremely difficult. And accessing the IMF in that environment without political change, I think is also going to be a tremendous challenge. Now, so what I'm trying to say here is that the size of this sustainability issue is so large that Russia by itself cannot do. Now then you say, well, it's not Russia, it's China. Well, the problem is that China, in fact, has been changing its perception on Venezuela. And China has been, in fact, reducing its exposure to Venezuela substantially. China had outstanding debt over $43 billion. It's down to outstanding debt in $23 billion. So they're reducing their exposure. In fact, they're increasing their exposures to other economies in the region: Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Mexico. So this is so the issue here is that China seems to be reducing its importance, and Russia seems to be increasing its relative importance, but it's still too small to make a difference. Let me show you where, and I'll conclude here with some examples of where things start going wrong for Venezuela in that relationship, and for Russia, and the difficulties. Look at state-to-state debt with the military equipment. Well, this at the end could not be paid. They needed to restructure. They went to the Club of Paris, they negotiated, and announced an agreement on November last year that hopefully the government is going to pay. But given the current financial constraints, I think it's going to be difficult for the government to keep that promise. Look at investments that Russians have done, not only in the oil sector, but in the mining sector, in Carbozulia, for example, which were investments that had faced enormous difficulties. Look at the refining complex agreement. There has been conversations between the government, the Chinese, and the Russians for them to take operational control and even asset control over the refinery complex in Venezuela. Well, the problem is, as attractive that deal could be, the problem is that in order to get a return on those investments, you need to produce oil. So if you want to keep sending oil to the US, if you want to send oil to your refining complex in Paraguaná, you need to produce that oil. So all of a sudden, something that could have been attractive is not that attractive because there's a productivity problem that is so serious in the oil sector that is undermining that possibility. Now, many say, well, but the Russians are investing. You see some investments going on, particularly in the gas sector with Rosneft. And the truth is what Rosneft is doing something that is very clever. They're swapping debt with a collateral in Citgo for a tremendous asset under the current gas legislation that allows them to take 100% control of the largest reserves in Venezuela in gas. And not only that, they're allowed to export 100% of what they produce. Now, when are they going to do that? That's a different question. But what I'm trying to show is the difficulties that relationship is facing. Having said that, I do think that for the regime, for Chavismo as a whole, Russia is a key ally. But it's a key ally in different ways. And it's providing interesting avenues of support for the government. Let me give you an example. In political advisory, the government, part of the reason why the government lost the National Assembly in 2015 is that they were extremely weak in the social networks, extremely weak. The opposition was very clever using networks during those elections. Well, the government learned, and it learned through working with big data. And that advisory, the Russians have played a very important role. If you look at cryptocurrencies, well, we know now that they have been providing that advisory, although that advisory doesn't seem to be working as well because the sanctions limit the ability of the cryptocurrencies to become a funding mechanism for PDVSA and for the Venezuelan state. However, it could become a mechanism for payments, international payments. So this is where I think that the relationship will be becoming increasingly more important. On these particular issues, they are key for stabilizing politically the regime and also for helping the regime to bypass international sanctions. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you. Francisco, please.
Sure. So I will be focusing, of course, on the oil industry and to understand the significant role and increasing role that Russian companies are playing in the Venezuelan oil sector is important first to give a sort of a general overview of what's happening in this sector. As you probably know, the collapse of oil production in Venezuela has been massive. Venezuela produced 3.5 million barrels of oil when Hugo Chavez came into power. Today it produces less than 1.5. Of those 3.5, at the time, about 3.2 were produced by PDVSA's own operated fields. And today, PDVSA's operated production is less than 700,000 barrels, and probably it could be at this point maybe even less than 600,000. So that's particularly on the side of the national oil company, it's a spectacular collapse that has been somehow dampened by the increase in production in the joint ventures with foreign partners. And as we'll see, one of these relevant partners is Rosneft. Why did production collapse? Well, the roots are old. You know, when Hugo Chavez came into power and had a conflict with the national company, he fired 20,000 employees, among them some of the best. The industry did not collapse immediately because the price of oil at that exact time started rising very significantly, and as a result, it's relatively easy to produce oil when the price of oil is very high because you can pay, $1 per barrel, $2 per barrel to service contractors. You can hire anyone, and you can be very inefficient and still produce some oil. And as I said, because Chavez was very lucky that because of an oil opening in the 90s, a lot of this new added production came from these projects that were started by foreign partners. In fact, the counterfactual that we should look at the first few years of Chavez, the first decade, is that production should have been above 4 million barrels according to the plans that were devised before, and it actually went down, right? And by the way, every single country in the world that had geological potential expanded production when the prices were high, as you would imagine. But the collapse, as Michael mentioned, has dramatically have become much steeper in the last few years because Hugo Chavez was extracting every single dollar from the national oil company and was making it get into debt to use those funds for consumption. And very little investment happened at the time. And so that happened with a high oil price environment. When the collapse in the price of oil came in 2014, they already were in arrears with service companies. They already were in arrears with their partners. And basically, because of the overvaluation of the official exchange rate, PDVSA didn't have even enough money to pay the salaries of the employees in bolivars. They had to ask the central bank for loans. Imagine when the price of oil collapsed, all these things became even worse. And as a result, the lack of investment, more recently, they have had this witch hunt against the executives that were close to Rafael Ramirez, the previous president of PDVSA and a rival to Nicolás Maduro. And so they have substituted that for a management of a general of the National Guard and a few other military persons without any experience whatsoever in the sector. And they have really mismanaged the relation with the partners. There are many other problems, security problems. A lot of the production in Venezuela has declined simply because they steal equipment. And this is, of course, there is a lot of people are involved because sometimes the equipment is not like a tiny thing. It's a 4-ton piece of equipment. Sometimes it is, small things that because employees are paid so low, they take home and they sell. And finally, the issue of security is also meaning that sometimes they cannot operate. There have been, assaults and robberies in the facilities of PDVSA. And of course now, because they are so badly paid and all these issues and potential for accidents, etc., employees do not want to show up to work. And so now it's becoming a really dramatic situation. And they were, up till now, relatively saved, as I said, by the joint ventures. But the thing is that a combination of US financial sanctions with these tremendous difficulties in the operation in the country in terms of all these issues are making it really hard for the partners to operate properly. And that's why we have been seeing a decline in production even there. Even though in the joint ventures, still most of the oil service contractors, the important oil service contractors, do provide services to them, while in the PDVSA side, they are almost gone. So that is the situation. Today, more than 60% of the production is in the hand of these joint ventures, and more than 2/3 is in extra heavy or heavy oil from the Orinoco belt, which requires, because of the decline in conventional production, the imports of diluents and in terms of either products like naphtha or light oil. So that's the very, very dire situation. In the last, there has been even during the time of the oil opening in the past, Russian companies were invited but decided not to participate. But with Chavez, slowly, some companies started to come to Venezuela in the oil sector. Lukoil and Gazprom at the beginning, Lukoil being a private company. But then, in the last I guess 6 to 7 years, Rosneft becomes the really important player in Venezuela and has a very different strategy than the other companies. In fact, today, the other companies have left. Only Rosneft is a player. And they operate around 140,000 barrels of oil today, making them among the 3 largest foreign companies in the country, along with Chevron and with CNPC, the Chinese national company. They basically, of those 140,000, 150,000 that they operate, they only own 40% of that because the equity is just 40. But they also have other assets in the Orinoco Belt for future projects. And as Michael mentioned, they recently got these 2 very attractive gas fields that are close to Trinidad and therefore are relatively easy to export through the facilities of Trinidad, and they got a very sweet deal on those. In addition to that, Rosneft has become, as the Chinese were sort of starting to become more careful, they gave loans to PDVSA of more than $5 billion. And that's on top of the separate debt that Michael mentioned with the Russian government, that is the one about military equipment, et cetera, where that is about $3 billion. And so that debt is a heavy carry for PDVSA because of the production of PDVSA of the, say, 1.4, 1.5 million barrels that PDVSA produces, 400 to 450,000 are given away in the domestic market, and then some quantity that is not too clear, but about 200,000 barrels are sent to Russia for repayment, or to not to Russia physically, but to Russian companies, particularly to Rosneft. A tiny bit, it's in a deal with Lukoil, but the one to repay the debt is that one. And so they recently announced that half of that debt had been paid. So that it shows to me that they actually been paying that with relatively, different from China, they have been actually paying. The other issue, as most of you probably know, is this thing that for the last loan of $1.5 billion, they got as a guarantee half of the shares of Citgo, the Venezuelan subsidiary, refining subsidiary based in Houston. And that created an issue in the U.S. Congressmen and senators wrote letters to the Treasury saying that, we cannot allow Rosneft to become a major player in the refining market in the U.S. And as a result of that, Rosneft has been looking at the possibility of swapping for some assets in Venezuela that guarantee. But that hasn't happened yet. And what is happening now is that a group of private investors are trying to buy that guarantee from Rosneft. And I don't know how far along is that operation, but it has been in the works for months, and I don't know if it's going to happen or not. And it would be interesting because it definitely will signal if they are more into caring for the money or protecting the Venezuelan regime. There is a possible future scenario in which the oil sector in Venezuela becomes less, in which Western companies become much less relevant, and the national companies of Russia and China become the biggest players in the country. That scenario, there are a few things happening that point towards that scenario. One is the increasing sanctions on the U.S. side. If the U.S. imposes further sanctions, either by tightening financial sanctions, for example, including insurance in cargo shipments, or adding an embargo, that will put in a difficult position some of the partners that export the oil from their joint ventures to the U.S. And of course, it will create more incentives for the Venezuelan government to try to have a tighter relationship with China and Russia in terms of the marketing of the oil. It depends on the details, but that could be a trend. The other one is the potential of default. Venezuela is already in default, but if there is a full-blown default and creditors start trying to take control over assets and flows from Venezuela, that will mean that they will have to, structure everything in a way in which, everything is sold. FOB will take, if the insurance issues are there, combined, there will have to be, the Chinese hired. It would have to be companies that do not operate in the Western sort of space in terms of insurance, et cetera. So it would be, I think, a very difficult situation for Western companies to operate in Venezuela. By the way, besides Chevron, we have a few of the Europeans that all put together are bigger even, but each of them has smaller pieces. Total, Statoil, Shell, Repsol, and Eni are the ones that. The last point that possibility. The question is, will the Russians and the Chinese take that, that space if that happens? It seems to me that for Rosneft to get some of the assets that Western companies have, for example, in the upgraders in the Orinoco Belt, is a very attractive proposition. It could have legal challenges, but if Venezuela expropriates the assets and then gives them to Rosneft, that's what they did with the Exxon project that currently Rosneft manages. They took it through TNK-BP when they acquired that company, and recently increased their share. So that's a possibility. One of the main difficulties with a scenario without Western oil companies is the role of service contractors. Service contractors are absolutely essential for maintaining and increasing production in Venezuela. And most of the big ones are Halliburton, Schlumberger, Weatherford, Baker Hughes, big American companies. And then there is a big ecosystem of much smaller companies that operate around the oil sector. And if those companies have to leave, and they are clearly reducing their activity in the country significantly, that will be a problem because there are not that many alternatives that could provide these services in the way or that have experience in Venezuela. There are some Chinese companies, there are a few other potential players, but that's going to be a problem. The last point that I wanted to make is that as Rosneft becomes this big player in Venezuela in the last few years, even though I'm not an expert on the foreign relations with Russia, it's clear to me that the head of Rosneft, Mr. Sechin, has become a very important and influential figure in the relationship between the two countries. He has been in Venezuela more than any other CEO of any company by a multiple of many times. He has been very active in becoming close to personal friend with some of the, he's a person who speaks perfect Spanish and Portuguese. He was a KGB agent that dealt with the Cubans. And so as a result, this is I think, I don't know how much he is driving the relation or if it's driven by the Kremlin, but in any case, he has taking a very personal and active role. He has, he inaugurated the Hugo Chavez Square in his natal town, and he paid for it. He has been very, very, very active. And so I think we have to consider, and that's a question for my colleagues that are experts on Russia, how much this relationship is relevant, separate from the purely geopolitical issue, how much the attractive contracts that they are, taking are also a driver or are either complement the, the more geopolitical, strategic issues that for which the Russian government cares about the Venezuelan regime, and also what would happen if there is a transition. My expectation is that Russian companies will continue to play some role, in Venezuela in the future. I've been impressed. I teach to executive program in which I recently had a significant number of Rosneft employees, and some of these people were extremely high quality individuals, executives. So they clearly are, paying attention to what they do there. So, but of course, it could be a traumatic transition to a new regime. And there are questions, of course, about the way some of these contracts have been issued recently. They have been more careful recently, I think, with what do they get. As Michael said, they got gas contracts that do not require the approval of the National Assembly, instead of getting more oil contracts that are supposed to go through the National Assembly. So maybe their lawyers are telling them let's be careful about a potential transition here. Anyways, I think it's going to continue to be a relevant relationship, the oil relationship between Russia and Venezuela, but there is a scenario in which it could become a really strong relationship. I think that's a scenario of much lower production, a much more isolated Venezuela, a very poor country, isolated one from the world, but one in which they could do some very attractive business.
Thank you. For the Russian perspective, Vladimir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for Kennan Institute and Latin American Program for organizing this event. It's good to be back here in Woodrow Wilson Center, and I just remember that a little bit more than 1 year ago we did a discussion on Russia and Latin America, and we are talking about Russia and Latin America once again. I'm not sure if it's really good news, but anyway, we are now focusing on one particular country in Latin America, which is Venezuela. Though I would like first to share with you my perspective why I believe that Latin America does matter for Russia, and then to illustrate some of these observations about the importance of Latin America for Russia for the case of Venezuela. I think the key value for Russia, the key value of Latin America, it's its geographical proximity to the United States. And it has been manifested by the Russian, by the way how Russia conducts its foreign policy in Latin America for a long time. Of course, Russia was absent for some time from the region following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then in the second part of the 1990s, they rushed in. And one of the first motivations was to look for new business opportunities. However, when Putin came to power in 2000, I think the traditional Russian vision of Latin America as the United States backyard was back. And it's not only the legacy of the Soviet vision of how the relations between Latin America and the United States matter to Russia, but it's also the new kind of tension that we are witnessing now that is building each time more between the United States and Russia that actually has its incident in the way how Russia conducts its policy in Latin America. Having said this, there are two other factors that really turns Latin America as an important asset for Russia, which sometimes are overlooked. One is the importance of Latin America for domestic political spectacles that is developing in Russia every day on the Russian TV, in the Russian mass media, on many other events in Russia. Because it's turned out, following the restoration of or nostalgia toward the Soviet times, the Kremlin and the Russian government realized that Latin America is extremely convenient in order to make public opinion in Russia appreciate the efforts by Vladimir Putin to restore the role, the greatness of Russia on the international arena. And I think Latin America is really the unique case because many Russians remember with nostalgia and with a very good feeling about the Soviet experience in Cuba. It's been heavily exploited by the Russian media, and at the same time, Latin America is far away, so it's making also easier for the Russian media to construct perhaps kind of a parallel reality because many Russians, of course, do not know, they do not visit Latin America, so they have a very ambiguous idea what Latin America is. The other factor, a part of the importance of Latin America for the political spectacle in Russia, and once again, I think this is overlooked, but it's extremely important because one of the reasons of popularity of Vladimir Putin is because many Russians believe that he managed to restore the greatness of Russia, so they needed some evidence, and they still need some evidence to show this. And the polls conducted in Russia show that Latin American countries are among the top friendliest nations, at least Cuba, Brazil, Venezuela appears there all the time. So a part of this, of course, there was a possibility of building economic links with Latin American countries and possibility for personal enrichment. Latin American countries and Russia, at least this left in Latin America, they do not share any common ideological base with Moscow as it was the case of the Soviet times. But Russians do love money, and many of these people, of course, look for the possibility of actually getting richer and richer because of these relations with Latin America. So I think this is obviously the case with Rosneft and with the people who are behind selling different kind of goods to Latin America. We know that during these years of the growing Russian economic presence, trade, which is not as significant as in other countries, of course, but it still provides with some opportunity of Russian government official and Russian businessmen involved in this. This was happening for a long time. So this is just some of the elements that, for me, explain the interest that Russia maintains to Latin America. Now, in case of Venezuela, I think almost all of these points can be clearly illustrated. Well, we're living today, I think, the new law in the relations between the United States and Russia. So from the Russian perspective, Latin America is the U.S. near abroad. So Russians are looking for an opportunity to actually have incident in this region to try to reciprocate, maybe not in terms that we can understand in direct terms, not to build a military, have a military presence here, but in the first place to show the Russian audience that Russia is capable to reciprocate what Russians believe is aggressive actions, damaging action by the United States in the Russian near abroad, and first of all in Ukraine. In fact, if you look the way how the Russian media portray the situation, how they explain the crisis in Venezuela, they make the direct connections with the Ukrainian case, because they're saying the case of Ukraine is the result of the U.S. Interference, the U.S. and the West aggressive action, so the same is happening in Venezuela. So many Russians think that they do understand, even they don't know the reasons of the crisis in Venezuela. Now, I think Russia is not prepared to leave Venezuela. This is my conclusion. I do agree that Russia actually has very limited resources in traditional terms. They do not have the money to actually solve any of the real problems of Venezuela. They don't know how to get this money. They're also suffering because of the sanctions. But I think Russians are extensively looking for different ways of engagement with Venezuela. Like you were saying, that the Russians help the government of Maduro to deal with big data. The Russians are very good in doing that. I think also there is a possibility that Russia might help Maduro even more in terms of political technologies, in terms of how to manipulate public opinion. And I think we have also to take into account that we are witnessing now a very dramatically and rapidly changing global context. We are talking about elections in Venezuela, and it is more likely that Maduro will win those elections. But please do not forget that Putin just won a similar kind of elections, even though, and Victor, you may correct me, but I think in the case of these elections, nobody was talking about Putin 4-0 or 3-0, yes? Like in case of Maduro, at least there is a kind of a discourse. But Putin simply cannot begin his new president term by losing another country like it happened in before. And Igor said, in answering your question, I think you're absolutely right. Putin builds many of his relations actually on personal trust with people. We know that relations between Putin and Chavez were really very strong because both leaders trusted each other a lot. Perhaps this is not the case between Putin and Maduro, but this is the case between Maduro and Igor Sechin. And Igor Sechin actually have 100% confidence by Vladimir Putin. And everything indicates that he is not prepared to leave Venezuela. Yes, he is going there. And you mentioned that he is the CEO, which foreign CEO, which most time spent in Venezuela. But in Russia, they're saying that Igor Sechin is spending more time in Venezuela than in the oil field of the company in Siberia. The climate is obviously better in Venezuela. So but I think there are a lot of things still going on. There are a lot of things that still are unveiling. This is the ongoing process. But once again, if we agree that one of the reasons or the key value of Latin America for Russia, because it's the U.S. near abroad, taking into consideration the tension, the level of tension that exists between Russia and the United States, I think Russia will continue showing an interest to Venezuela. It is not prepared to leave. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Victor.
Thank you. Well, I want to also thank the organizer of the event, both Kennan Institution and Wilson Center, and taking once more some points already taken by my colleagues. I would start with a small historical anecdote, which is has something to do with today's model of Russian-Venezuelan relations. Venezuela was not among the first Latin American countries to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, but it was Venezuelan politician, revolutionary, who had, I think, the first direct contact with Russian Foreign Ministry in 1926, when Gustavo Machado went to Moscow, representing Venezuelan Revolutionary Party, and had an interview with Maxim Litvinov, deputy foreign minister at the moment, and asked Moscow for financial assistance to make an armored expedition with the purpose to overthrow Venezuelan president. And he was denied any kind of financial and political assistance with a very simple explanation. You have no political perspective, so you would never become our political ally. And the story had ended at the moment, but it explains very much an essence of Russian-Venezuelan relations today. Actually, when Russia in the early 19th made a kind of retreat from Latin America, it was because model of relation with Cuba was not profitable one. It costed too much, and politically and financially, and Moscow tried to establish a kind of only economic relations with Latin American countries, and Venezuela was not among those countries to have profitable economic relations. It was Argentina, it was Brazil, but not Venezuela. But everything has changed in this century because of personality of Hugo Chavez. He had a kind of personal contact with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, and because of successes of 2008, while there was a conflict in southern Caucasus between Russia and Georgia, Venezuela became one of the few countries to recognize the independence of Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, while the countries from which Russia was expecting support did nothing to recognize Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia. But then came Nicaragua, and the second was Venezuela. I thought, okay, we recognize that those countries are independent ones. And still, Hugo Chavez portrait is in Southern Ossetia coins. And at that moment, Moscow began to consider Venezuela as a possible ally in Latin America, and not only within Latin America, but also as a part of future construction of so-called multipolar world. Because Venezuela managed to sell to Russian idea Venezuela as an intermediary to Latin American integration processes with ALBA and UNASUR. Both of them are rather dead now. And at that moment, Venezuela began to receive the first loan to buy Russian arms. And that was not exactly a trade, because Moscow and Caracas had about 4 billion volume of trade, but all of these 4 billions will trade with Russian loans. It's not the same in case of Brazil or Argentina. Later on appeared, as Michael and Francisco already told, some Russian companies like Surgutneftegas and Lukoil.
I still have an impression that it was not Lukoil's personal decision to come to Venezuela, but it was like a cover for future coming of Rosneft. Lukoil is still a private company, and it cannot spend a lot of money if it gets no profits, but Rosneft can, because Rosneft is a state-owned company, and it can be used also for political penetration to one or another country. Everything has changed since the beginning of deepening of economic crisis, because the crisis began still under Chavez presidency, but the prices of oil were much more higher. Venezuela cannot offer now, cannot sell now Latin American integration idea as something very interesting for Moscow, as this integration is not developed according to previous plans, and Venezuela cannot say that we are now constructing multipolar world, because Venezuela became more and more isolated, even within Latin America and also in the world. But and Putin is not a philanthropist to maintain Venezuela's economy, and Russia doesn't possess really, as Michael, of the possibility to give $20 billion of dollars for the first year. Russia is not a philanthropist. All the loans Venezuela receives now are the loans given in exchange for economical assets. Moscow learned a lot from the times when China won competition with Russia for Venezuelan economical assets in the last decade. But as we have a new edition of Cold War now, all the circumstances have changed. Venezuela is considered now as one of political allies, very weak one, very isolated, but still one of the few allies. And while you are at the war, even cold one, you cannot forget about allies. I think that is one of the main reasons for Moscow to maintain relations with Venezuela. And another one, as Vladimir already referred to, Moscow has a fear of so-called colored revolutions. Venezuela is considered as a place where one of those revolutions would take place. For overwhelming majority of Russian, Venezuelan crisis is just because of Venezuela's oil resources and just because the CIA organized all the crisis. Well, Venezuela has not the largest oil resources, but considerable ones, and we know that the crisis not necessarily all organized by external factors. There are a lot of internal factors and means management also, but the perception of big part of Russian population is that the West is trying to do in Venezuela the same that already happened in Ukraine. In this case, withdrawal from Venezuela would mean for Russian president a kind of political defeat, and he is not going to lose the game. And I agree completely with Vladimir that Venezuela might be the last place in Latin America from where Russia would retreat voluntarily. It's not because of economy, because Venezuelan economy is not, it is not now in the best conditions, and I don't know when the good conditions would return to Venezuela, but it's still a political game. And at least at the moment, we can observe that Russian-US relations still would be worse and worse, And in this case, Venezuela is still one of chess figures to use to win the comprehensive global game. And that is when I'm ending also. Thanks.
Great. Victor, I'm going to ask, oh, excuse me, Risa. Goodness, Risa, please. Sorry.
No
Go
problem.
ahead, please.
So I've been asked to comment a bit about the U.S. piece of this puzzle, where we are in terms of U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela, and then we can talk a bit about what that means for the Venezuela-Russia relationship. So, I would say under the Obama administration that the policies towards Venezuela were, I think, still for the most part focused on engagement. We had multiple efforts at trying to broker dialogue or engage in dialogue between the opposition and the government. Obama did move to impose individual sanctions, but in general, I think was more focused on engagement and also on a kind of multilateral approach to Venezuela, trying to work with governments in the region to send a message, kind of raise the pressure on the government, chiefly through the OAS, but through some of the other regional organizations as well. What we've seen under the Trump administration is certainly a shift towards more isolationism and a much more aggressive policy stance. I mean, certainly rhetorically, we've now had military options put on the table. But in terms of the sanctions as well, the August sanctions that the Trump administration put in place, they're on paper are aimed at limiting new financing to the government, and I would say in practice have been very effective in terms of limiting the government's options and really creating a lot of problems for them just in terms of their basic financial transactions and ability to secure new resources. In terms of the companies that are still operating in Venezuela, there are still a number of U.S. and Western companies that operate not even only in the oil sector, but beyond that. One piece of the sanctions that has really had a huge impact that Francisco touched on is that a lot of the service companies had been accepting promissory notes instead of payment, so basically IOUs from PDVSA, which now they can no longer accept with these sanctions. I think that's been an important factor in the overall production decline story. Other companies that are in Venezuela have had to change their banking relationships. And another issue is that the sanctions limited basically credit to the government and PDVSA to 30 and 90 days, respectively. And for a government that tends to pay very late, if at all, that meant that a lot of companies that had been working with the government were then concerned about kind of de facto violating U.S. sanctions. And so I think that's been a big issue in terms of some change in their behavior. On the financial side, I mean, I would say that the government had largely already lost market access, but there were still efforts to kind of have creative deals, selling some bonds that were held in the central bank's balance sheets, for example, to certain funds, and those were still happening last year. And so I think obviously the sanctions prevented that. And I think another important piece here obviously is that they prevent any sort of debt restructuring. So we now have the government in this kind of bizarre limbo where they've defaulted on most of their obligations since December, but no one's really doing anything yet. I think partly because of this impediment that's going to make things very difficult for bondholders. The sanctions, I would say, from an economic perspective, have really limited the government's options. I mean, they were already limited, but I would say reinforce that trend, and do, I think, make bilateral partners like Russia all the more important, just in terms of the few options that they have out there. Now, in terms of what other options are on the table from the U.S. perspective, I think there's a few different sanctions possibilities that are being contemplated. The first would be a ban on the sale of diluents and lighter crudes, which, as Francisco was mentioning, is really critical to Venezuela's oil sector right now, as we've seen these production declines in the lighter fields. In order to make the heavier crude commercially viable, you really need those products, lighter crudes, to mix and make it basically economically viable, right? So that would be kind of a first step, I think, in terms of a more limited option targeting the oil sector, where it would be an inconvenience for the Venezuelans. They would have to source elsewhere, and it would have less of an impact, I think, domestically, because on the U.S. side, the U.S. is providing about half of those exports right now that PDVSA is taking. But I would say, that's easy enough to find other markets, whereas it is, I think, a big economic inconvenience for PDVSA. The other and much more, I think, devastating policy option on the table would be an import ban that would prevent the U.S. from importing Venezuelan crude. As Cindy mentioned at the top, Venezuela, we've seen these dramatic production declines, but Venezuela was still the third largest crude supplier to the U.S. last year. It's still a very important partner. And there are some important domestic considerations here as well. The Gulf Coast refiners many of them are built to optimize Venezuelans' particular type of heavy crude. And so that import ban would force them to import from elsewhere. And there are alternative sources, but it's a kind of economic inconvenience there, and would probably come at a higher cost. One of the big problems is that in terms of sources of similar heavy crude, you have production declining also in Mexico and kind of stagnant in Colombia. And the Canadian crude, which is a kind of good substitute, the infrastructure isn't there to bring it to the Gulf Coast. And so that's also a challenge. Obviously, that's, I think, a consideration on the U.S. policy side is, whether or not you want to impose that on these refiners. It would probably have a modest impact on gasoline prices, especially in the southeastern U.S. And obviously, the Trump administration is going to have to take into consideration that the timing of the Venezuelan election is right before the kind of peak summer driving season here in the U.S. So that's obviously a political consideration. And then finally, Francisco mentioned that there's also this consideration of doing some sort of ban on insurance that would be, a challenge for PDVSA in terms of insuring cargoes. That's something that was imposed in the case of Iran. That would be kind of a further way to target the oil sector and is another option on the table. So in terms of kind of connecting this back to the Russia piece, how would this impact the relationship between Venezuela and Russia? And I think Francisco already touched on a couple of these points. But the ban on U.S. exports, one important piece to the relationship right now in terms of PDVSA importing from the U.S. is the Citgo relationship. That PDVSA is actually about 20% of the imports it takes from the U.S. are done via swaps from Citgo. And as it runs out of cash, it's more and more reliant on these swaps in general because it just doesn't have any other resources. We've seen them entering into swap agreements with Rosneft. I think that's something that would become more and more the option, is to rely on some of these bilateral partners, these kind of friendlier state-owned companies to do this type of swap. But certainly I think that export ban would certainly push them in that direction. The same thing goes on the import ban. So if the U.S. were to impose the import ban, the only two other markets in the world that have refineries that could actually process Venezuela's crude outside of the U.S. are China and India. And the India piece is interesting because Russia actually now owns Essar, which is one of the main refineries in India. And so I think, in those terms, that import ban would push those relationships, I think, would become a much bigger part of their oil flows in general. And obviously, I think Russia would play a big role in that India piece in particular, and then China also a relevant player there. Obviously, I think all of these options are going to have important implications for Venezuela's cash flow at a time where we've kind of run out of adjectives to describe the situation and how challenging it is. But I do think that these are all options that are being seriously considered, and I think in some sense will kind of reinforce the incentives on the Venezuelan side to turn to the Russians and others for creative alternatives. I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you all for your presentations. I'm going to start just by asking a question. A lot of the presentations have focused on the economic dimensions and the role of Rosneft, and not to discard the importance of the political relationships and what both of you have portrayed as Latin America as the near abroad. But I'd like to ask all of you to delve a little bit more into the kind of security relationship that Russia has with Venezuela, which I think is, in addition to the importance in the economy, despite its limitations, one of the key things that concerns policymakers in the United States. So if you could give a little more detail on the kind of weaponry, including airplanes, and the likelihood, given what you've said about the importance of not losing Venezuela for Putin's prestige and Russia's prestige in the world, what do you expect would be the extent of Russian security involvement in preventing a collapse or any kind of transition that was seen as, or that could be viewed as a defeat, for Russia's interests? I'll invite any and all of you to take that up.
Well, actually, Russian-Venezuelan cooperation in the field of security reasons started when Venezuela was denied to buy F-16s and bought some Russian fighters. Later on, it also bought anti-aircraft system and a lot of other arms. Also, the last time China is surpassing Russia in selling arms to Venezuela. But what both Russia and Venezuela still have are the contacts between the military. Venezuelan defense minister went some times to Russia, and there's some about some centuries of Venezuelan military officers who are trained now in Russia. And kind of story which I still do not understand very well. A lot of Venezuelan officers who are studying in Russia but not in military shoes. They decided to become doctors, biologists. They are really attending the classes in different universities, but all of them are rank and file militaries. And they come to Russia with their families and live there for some years. It's a kind of story which is not very clear for me. What are they doing now in Russia? But I suppose that Russia decided to maintain a bunch of contacts to establish direct contacts and not to do it through Cuban side. Because the country which is more involved in military issues in Venezuela is Cuba, not Russia, not China. But in the last years, we can observe that Russia is trying to increase its involvement in the contacts with the Venezuelan military. One of the possible explanation is Russia cannot exclude a kind of military coup in Venezuela and is going to have contacts in case of military rank and file decide to change Venezuela's president. But I'm not think that Russia is going to protect Venezuela military in case of an armed conflict. I don't think that Russia is going to send troops to Venezuela to maintain Venezuelan government. First of all, because Bolivarian revolution is not Russian revolution, is not our struggle. Second one is because of too many political risks and too many political costs of such a decision, and it's too far to be able to maintain military. We can demonstrate that we are here, that we organize some kind of military exercise together with Venezuelans, but it's not the same that to send troops to defend the government.
Others on that question?
I just remember that a month ago I was taking a flight from Bogota to one of the Caribbean islands, and when you watch on the screen the route of the plane, in former days it was fly through the Venezuelan airspace, but this time you see clearly how Avianca flight, the Colombian airline, is avoiding entering the Venezuelan airspace and doing all this deroute and going then to avoid for whatever cost it takes to enter the Venezuelan airspace. And the reason is, of course, too obvious, because some time ago, a Colombian Avianca jet was chased by two Sukhoi over Venezuela. And I remember when Venezuela announced that it's going to buy the weapons from Russia, Hugo Chavez was pointed towards Colombia. Look, Colombia, now we can protect ourselves. And we are becoming really an important, in military terms, nation in Latin America. And this is one of the issues that sometimes is also overlooked, because the Russian engagement of Venezuela in terms of arms sales actually created a lot of worries in the neighboring countries. And when at some point Russia announced that it's going to sell what was the plant, I guess, to build some Kalashnikov weapons, rifles in Venezuela, actually it generated a lot of concern in the neighboring countries. I think the military engagement between Russia and Venezuela is extraordinary these days. Venezuelan militaries get training in Russia. Russian arms constitute an important part of Venezuelan military strength. And of course, I still do not believe, and it's very hard for me to imagine, that there might be any permanent military presence by Russia in Venezuela. It's too costly. It is too far away. It is difficult to perceive now, to think actually, to what kind of tangible advantage it will give Russia, a part of Putin, again, the risk their military and the possibilities of the US answer to that. But again, I mean, we're living in a constantly changing world, and we would never imagine, perhaps even 4 or 5 years ago, that what is happening in Syria now would happen. So I think for now it is clear that there is a very strong security cooperation between Venezuela and Russia. We shouldn't speculate, since it's very difficult to have the precise information of the nature of the links, but I think there is also more than simply training of militaries. Russians are interested in having one or another kind of presence in Latin America, precisely because I believe that Russian elite think about Latin America as the U.S. near abroad. And this logic actually manifested in the attempts to strengthen and maintain these security links between Venezuela and Russia.
Just to be precise, so you don't see Russia putting troops in, but given the importance of the security relationship, they're training, they're exchanging visits, that kind of thing, they're selling arms or giving arms on concessional terms, but you don't see a provocation developing between Russia.
I don't think Russia is prepared actually to send troops openly to Venezuela. What we've seen, though, is one of the new modus operandi in Syria is the participation of the private military companies. And I know that in some cases Russia did send some, from what I understand, armed guards to protect the assets of Rosneft with all this insecurity climate. So I think we might perhaps see a kind of move of Russia toward this direction in certain circumstances. But still, I mean, I don't think that Russia is prepared to send troops to Venezuela.
Great. And this may be an unfair question because it's a little afield of the topic of the morning, but Cuba has reported to have a significant security and intelligence presence in Venezuela, particularly in the armed forces. There are times over the 50-plus years of the Cuban Revolution that Cuba and the Soviet Union and then Russia have worked very much hand in hand. There have been other times when there have been great tensions in that relationship. So I'd like to ask perhaps Michael and others if you have any way that you feel prepared to characterize the extent of the relationship, the existence of tensions between Cuba, Russia, in terms of the security relationships, and also the extent to which Cuba is involved and has a very, very strong intelligence presence, especially?
My sense is that that Cuba and Russia are very much aligned in the interest of regime survival in Venezuela. And when you think after hearing most of the interventions here, what I realize is that Russia is going to be tremendously useful, not in growing the oil sector, not in growing military capabilities, but in actually stabilizing at a very low level oil production for Venezuela and stabilizing also operational capabilities at the military level. I think the Cubans provide more of an intelligence kind of service, which they've been providing for many years now, and it's tremendously sophisticated. And I think also that the Caracas is looking at political advisory, as Vladimir was saying, where Russians can teach them how to manipulate public opinion, how to use social networks for that objective, and there the Cubans, I think, are obviously less useful. So this is at the end what I see here is a conversion of interest both on the Russians and on the Cubans on regime survival. In fact, as I understand, part of the frustration, at least of the Colombians, with the negotiation process, was that throughout the process of negotiation in the DR, they realized that Cuba was really not interested in having a successful negotiation process, and part of it has to do, obviously, with the fact that you have a change of U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba, that puts Venezuela in an even more strategic importance for Cuba, as even though Venezuela has reduced the numbers of oil barrels that we send to Cuba, they remain significant for the island. So I think this is what at the end, I think this is a story of how these different countries, whether it's Cuba or Russia, or whether it's even China or Turkey, for example, where Venezuela is re-engaging constantly now with Turkey, they're not going to provide a source of financing and growth, but they might provide a very important source and technology, and even enough financing for regime survival.
Francisco, and then Vladimir.
Sure. I just wanted to sort of add a little bit to this oil dimension of the relationship between the three countries. Because of the decline in Venezuela's shipments to Cuba to about half of what they were, they not only cover the domestic market of Cuba, but allow them to re-export part of it, and it was a very significant source of revenue. Today is still, I think, by far the most significant source of revenue, even at half. It's shy of $2 billion per year. It's a significant amount, and we can see how other countries in the Caribbean that have been cut from Venezuela have suffered. Nicaragua recently, for example. So I as the U.S. reapproachment with Cuba sort of freezes back, I think for Cuba, Venezuela remains a tremendously strategic relation. And interestingly, Mr. Sechin also, who has a very good relationship with the Cubans, went to Cuba and to offer them, an alternative to get the additional oil that they need, which historically was supplied, by the Soviet Union, and then they did these swaps with, the Venezuelan refineries in Germany got the Soviet crude, and Venezuela sent the crude to Cuba. I'm talking about before Chavez. So they have to figure out a way to manage these relations. And without a doubt, the fact that the intelligence services of Cuba are still having a significant role in Venezuela, I think maybe less than during Chavez, because the military, I think, tried to limit a little bit their role, and the military in Venezuela have been more powerful with Maduro than with Chavez, in the sense that he relies more on them. But still, an important relation. And of course, as they mentioned, it's amazing to see Vladimir Padrino, in Twitter all the time, the Minister of Defense in Moscow, even during cold times, that I don't think he likes going there. So without a doubt, that's also a very important relation.
Great. Much easier to go, or much better to go from Colombia to the Caribbean than to Moscow. Go ahead.
Yes, definitely. Just about the cold weather in Russia, I remember once I was watching Chavez saying that he would travel twice as much to Russia, if not the winter. I think in the case of Cuba and Russia cooperation in Venezuela, it should be a very interesting case because despite that some may think, I think Russia has never managed truly reestablish the level of trust that Cuba had with the Soviet Union. I think for Cuba, to a certain extent, this ideological stand is still somewhat important, either for the official discourse or really some people still believe in those ideas. It's difficult to say, but it's clear that the level of trust has never reached the same level between Russia and Cuban government now that it used to be between the Soviet Union and Fidel Cuba. So in the case of their cooperation, I think Russians would look for an opportunity to improve their relations with Cuba using Venezuelan scenario. But at the same time, I think they also would like to have their own role more significant in terms of military arrangement between between Venezuela and Russia, because as I was saying, the global context is very important to understand what will happen in the relation between Russia and Venezuela. So I think Russians would actually prefer to have the 100% control in their own hands, than share some kind of responsibility and possibilities with Cuba. But then Michael said something very important, and I would like just to comment on that, because Russia does not have money and is not prepared to spend a lot of money to actually improve the situation in Venezuela. But Russia may well be willing actually to freeze the current situation. And if we just think what Russia is doing in some other place of the world, like in some part of Eastern Europe, or in some part of the parts of the world, I think Russians know how to do that. So that might be one of the options for Venezuela, unfortunately.
Victor, very, very briefly, and then we're going to
Just one point to add. Vladimir is right when he is talking that Russia never tried to reestablish the level of trust with Cuba of Soviet times, but there was only one issue when Cuba never shared information with the USSR. It was intelligence service. The USSR had its own intelligence service, and Cuba has its own, and Cuba never shared information. And I see almost improbable a kind of cooperation between Cuba and Russia in issues of maintaining control over Venezuelan military.
Great. Okay, we have time for questions. Please raise your hand, and we'll take them in a group. And I see a lot of hands, so let's go for the first round. This person in the back, please wait for the microphone, and please tell us who you are. We'll start here.
Hi, Vanessa Neumann. Hello, Francisco.
Hi.
Okay, I'm particularly interested in hearing from the Russians what their reaction, or what they think Russian reaction would be to a very particular scenario. May 20th, we're having elections, in quotation marks, in Venezuela. Venezuelans broadly reject Henry Falcon as a stalking horse, basically funded by the regime. That's a very strong view, right? there's a very small scenario where Henry Falcón wins. The arguments being Chavistas might view it as a soft exit, there could be an avalanche, they can't get their act together, etc. Small probability, high impact scenario, Henry Falcón wins. How do the Russians react, given the fact that he may or may not be a stalking horse, likely is, and might be some sort of soft continuation of the regime? Do the Russians accept it as it, and either legitimize it as sort of an opposition guy, or to how much of a hand do they extend to this strange character of a potential Henry Falcón presidency?
Okay, thank you. Pedro, right here in the front.
Pedro Borelli, also focusing a little bit on the Russian perspective. There is a thought that Russian foreign policy has actually been hijacked by Igor Sechin towards Venezuela. While there was conversations about the relationship between Putin and Chavez, Chavez went to Russia 9 times. Putin only went once in what was said to be the worst foreign trip he ever took, a 24-hour trip to Caracas, which was a total disaster, as prime minister. And he hasn't been there since. Maduro's last visit to Moscow was less than lackluster, and it was basically to force him to restructure the debt, to rewrite all the debt. I think it was more of a rescue of Russia off Russia than anything they were doing for Venezuela, because the debt terms, existing debt terms, were not good enough. So at the same time, in this collapse of the oil industry, people would say that Rosneft is a company that's the angriest at the chaos that has been created by the naming of this general that has basically exacerbated problems that were already existing. So I would almost say that this is not working really well. I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything to point out that there's a good relationship there, except just, you know, the idea of facing off the United States and kind of playing that little role. You don't want to lose the United States. But I just get a sense that there's a great deal of frustration in Russia, and I'm not sure that having diplomats riding around in bulletproof cars in Caracas and having Rosneft having its equipment being stolen and the debt having to be restructured by a minister of finance who's very much in disagreement with what's going on in Venezuela speaks of a very good relationship. And my sense that this is all being borne by the fact that Igor Sechin put his eyes in 2008, as you mentioned, around the Georgian war. He said, well, if nobody takes care of this, I'm interested in this, and has been signing deals at a pace that it's not related to his investment, because it's just, I think it's almost signing options. And those seem to be options that you want to play when there's a good government, not options that you're willing to play with this government. So my sense is, could we actually be reading this all wrong? And that what you have is a Russia that is positioning itself in a weak situation with the expectation that eventually will have a great standing if things get better, because they have not profited a great deal. I would say the one thing that they have profited, which was not mentioned, is that when Chavez arrived in power in 98, it was very close when Putin was to arrive to power. Venezuela was producing 3.4 million barrels of oil, and Russia was producing 4.6. Venezuela's target was to be at 5.5 by 2004, 2005. Venezuela is now producing 1.5, and Russia is producing 10.6. So I would posit that Venezuela has basically surrendered 4 million barrels of its market share to Venezuela, to Russia. And that's really the main benefit of this relationship. The collapse of Venezuela has been very good, and it's provided Russia with 2 booms, a production boom and a price boom. And those are the ones that have made that Russia, that strong Russia that Putin really likes to portray around the world. And that's been the benefit of the Venezuelan relationship, its collapse.
Thanks. We'll take one more from the back. Yes, this gentleman.
Thank you, everybody, for the interesting interpretation of the Russian situation in Venezuela. I come from a technology.
Please tell us your name. I'm sorry.
Willy Valdivia.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering, you know, we are discussing Russia like a superpower, but Russia has half of the GDP of the state of California. So, you know, in terms of economical means to sustain a political or interference in Venezuela is very limited. What I wonder is, what do you see the future of Russian intervention in Venezuela with transferring all these responsibilities to China? China has the means, the intentions to acquire all these resources for their own benefit.
Great. So we have a question about the potential victory of Henri Falcon in the May 20th elections, one about how sort of, how shall I describe Pedro's comment, taking issue and saying that it's actually Venezuela's collapse that's been of great benefit, and then finally on this question of China and how it will benefit. Let's ask, so we can take one more round, let's ask everybody to be pretty brief. Who would like to start?
Well, I would respond very briefly about probabilities of Russian reaction towards Falcon's victory. In case of very improbable Falcon's victory in Venezuela's elections, I suppose that Russia would recognize Falcon as a Venezuelan president. And additionally, because Falcon still maintains contacts with some Chavista sectors within Venezuela. So Russia would most probably would have another kind of relation with Falcon in case he wins, but still would consider Falcon as a possible partner in Venezuela.
Well, let me talk a little bit about Igor Sechin and actually the Venezuelan case being a success case for Russia, but from a different perspective. There's a famous anecdote in the 1930s, I guess, one of these famous Soviet writers, Mikhalkov, who happened to be the author of 3 different versions, first of the Soviet anthem and then the current Russian anthem. So he came to Stalin and he started to complain about the quality of the Soviet writers. He was told, well, you know, they're not very good. They're not writing good novels. You know what Stalin told him? I simply do not have other writers. You have to deal with them. So I think in the case of Venezuela, it's very clear that this is a very weak political regime. It's been for a long time on the verge of the collapse. Perhaps Russia did profit from this market share shift, even though I don't think it was an intentional. But in this development, in this new Cold War, with the high level of tension between the U.S. and Venezuela, I think Russia simply do not have enough other allies that they can actually to try to somehow challenge the United States. So Igor Sechin, if to a certain extent I do agree, because we all know that in Russia the decision process is somewhat different from many other places, and personal connections do play an important part. And in the case of Igor Sechin, is one of the most powerful and continues to be one of the most powerful person in Moscow. But I think Igor Sechin is also well aware about this kind of a development. I mean, Putin was just re-elected as Russian president, but there are already some signs, because I don't think the process has already started, but there are some signs of the beginning of some political games in Moscow post-Putin. So Igor Sechin is one of the key players in this process, and I think he wouldn't like to lose Venezuela, and then someone in Moscow will actually, you have to pay the bill. Look, we lost this a lot of money. So I think he is well aware of this as well. Thank you.
Yes, briefly, I mean, I agree with Pedro that the relations are at a very bad point today in terms of the oil sector. I mean, they couldn't be more upset with the current administration of PDVSA, and in fact they have told repeatedly the Maduro not to remove Eulogio del Pino. And so they are unhappy with the situation right now, and unhappy with the general business climate in the oil industry. I do think that the collapse, without a doubt, the collapse of Venezuela has been a blessing for OPEC. And interestingly, I remember when Nicolás Maduro and Venezuela started to push for Russia to get together with OPEC and with Saudi Arabia. At the beginning, my friends, experts in Saudi Arabia, told me that's never going to happen. That's a losing proposition. Well, it happened. I don't know how relevant the role of desperate Venezuela trying to get these two partners together, but that has been a very interesting development in the oil sector. The strong ties between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and without a doubt, the collapse of Venezuela came at the precise exact time that all they needed that. I'm not so sure that the Russians, have any role in the collapse in the sense of promoting it internally, but I do think that they might not be too unhappy with at least the collapse that is not related to their own production, of course. So that's in terms of China. I think China has been very. China got burnt in Venezuela. They also are extremely unhappy with how things evolved. And we can see that they recently have been very hesitant to, expose themselves more to Venezuela. They, unlike the Russians, even though they have recognized the National Constituent Assembly and they have been set bridges with the Venezuelan opposition and have done things that show that they want to be perceived as a long-term player in Venezuela with whatever administration is in power. They don't have, I think. It's a little bit embarrassing for them that that after lending Venezuela billions of dollars, this is the worst economy in the planet. But I don't think they have that much sort of invested, as you point out, with as personally with the case of Putin. So I think they will be hesitant to go in further. But if you are offered the opportunity to market the remaining production of Venezuelan oil and to take control over some assets that that are perfectly commercially viable, that were exploited by Western companies, I would be surprised if they are not interested.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think both Russia and China have to be considering a regime change scenario, right? Maduro is looking, I think, pretty strong in this particular election, and over the past year, obviously, the opposition has had a lot of struggles. But, this is a very, very fragile situation that I think over the medium term looks very hard to sustain, right? So, I'm sure the Russians would like to see it sustained. The Chinese, I completely agree, I think are mostly just want to get repaid. The Venezuelans still owe them around $25 billion, and so that's their chief concern. But I think in both cases they have to be hedging a bit, and the fact that we do have these gas deals that don't require the National Assembly, I think, is evidence of that, right? That you want to make sure the assets you're acquiring now are honored by a future government, if and when that happens.
Michael.
I agree with the idea that both Beijing and Moscow are totally frustrated with the mismanagement and the lack of capabilities in policy making to deal with not only with the oil sector problems, but with the macroeconomic situation in Venezuela. And this is basically, there's this story about Macri going to China, having dinner with Xi Jinping, and they start talking about Venezuela, and Xi Jinping says, well, they don't look serious. Very frustrated about it. So I think that's the mood, right? But that does not necessarily imply that they're ready to let go. I think that particularly in the case of Russia. Now, I think Russia is also being very careful of not exposing itself to collapse in Venezuela, just like it happened in Libya when they went in, very eagerly to invest in the oil sector, and you had a complete collapse, and they lost a lot in that process. So that I think is that risk, I think, is in the mind of whoever is setting the foreign policy towards Venezuela in Moscow. Now, regarding the Falcón question, and this is how I see it. Okay, it's a very low. I agree, it's a low probability, high impact scenario. But in order for Falcón to win, he needs to double the average difference that the polls are showing. Why? because of the nature of the electoral system. And he has to double that difference, which right now is 8% to 16% in less than a month, right? And among voters that are sure to go out to vote, to cast their votes. And there are only two avenues to do this strategically. One avenue is that you get people out to vote. And the problem he's having is that, opposition voters are not willing to go out. Half of the opposition voters are not willing to participate. So he has a real challenge in mobilizing that without unity and without support of the rest of the opposition that has decided basically to sit out of the election. And the other option is to bring in Chavista dissatisfied voters. But as I've proven, and I've written a lot about this, the use of technology and clientelism, which has reached such a sophisticated level in Venezuela. I mean, all the Latin American countries right now on the 20th century of this story. I mean, you read about Mexico, you read about Argentina. It's all very low tech. We're in a very high tech strategy regarding this, and in fact, when you look at voters, Chavista voters very rarely shift, and part of it has to do with the use of, in particularly this electronic card. Now, and so here I think again the Russians, they've not been involved in that technology, but I think they can provide. They will provide in terms of a manipulation of public opinion, in terms of using this big data to target more effectively voters, people, etc. It's going to be tremendously useful in order to the government to entrench and to survive whatever they perceive the threat from abroad really is.
Okay. Let's take two more questions and one quick last round as people sort of start to dribble out, which is very discouraging. Yes, this gentleman here with the beard in front, and then we'll take this gentleman in the way back. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Diego Sharifkir. I just arrived from Venezuela 3 weeks ago to study a master's here in the US. And a question about the influence Russia has in Venezuela. Being on the ground in Venezuela, you don't really feel as much influence by the Russians now as it was while Chavez was alive. And does what's happening in Ukraine and Syria have an impact on that? Like having those big problems so close to Russia, does that influence the influence of Russia over Venezuela and its interests about what's happening in Venezuela?
Okay, this gentleman here with the tie, and then we'll go back. Brief last comments. Go ahead.
Sure. Alex Sanchez, I'm a defense analyst here in Washington. Very small, obscure question. Has anyone heard anything about that Kalashnikov factory that Russia is supposed to be building in Maracay in Venezuela? That project was announced back in 2006, 2007 when Chavez was around, and it's been delayed again and again. I think somebody stated last month that it was going to be built by 2019. Has anyone heard anything about the project? And what do the delays in the project say about the status of Russian-Venezuela defense relations? That the Russian government is not willing to finish a project unless the Venezuelan government is able to pay for it. Thank you.
Okay, very quick last round. Who wants to start, Victor?
Well, as for Russian influence since starting of Ukrainian and Syrian crisis, I think that as we already told, as we are at a new edition of Cold War, Russia who would consider possibilities to retreat from Venezuela is not considering that possibility anymore. And since the beginning of those two crises, Russia is closing more precisely on what is going on and what would be going on in Venezuela.
Anyone else? Francisco?
Yeah, I think part of why it looked much more closer at the time had also to do with money. Venezuela had plenty of it, and by the way, Russia had too, because the price of oil was high, and both were benefiting from it. But in particular, having Chavez as a friend, I remember it was not only Russia; like everybody else wanted to be a friend of Chavez at the time, and so then sell him stuff, right? With Maduro, every meeting with Maduro, he asks you for money. He doesn't give you any. So there's a difference.
Great.
Very quickly, I think Russians still have incidents, a great deal of incident in Venezuela. Perhaps your observation that you hear less Russian language spoken in Venezuela is due to insecurity in Venezuela. Many people have to be evacuated, as far as I understand. The Russian diaspora, which was by any measurement not as small in some other parts of the world, of course, but we were talking about maybe 15,000 Russians residing permanently in Venezuela till the beginning of really tough times in Venezuela. They almost all gone. And about Kalashnikov factory, one of the reasons, not of course the key reason, not the strategic reason, but one of the reasons why Russians were so eager dealing with Chavez was the possibility of making money. And some of that money just disappeared in the pockets of some of the people. And we know a part of some of the other projects, for example, Chavez announced when the mayor of Moscow was Yuri Lushkov, who visited Caracas, they announced that they will actually build some apartment houses of public interest for low stratus in Venezuela. And it's never happened. And the money disappeared. And the company that was created in Russia to provide, to do this project also disappeared. So there were some small details that, yeah.
Great. I'd like to thank our speakers, thank our co-sponsors in the Kennan Institute, Victor, Vladimir, Francisco, Risa. Michael, please join me in thanking them.